Good morning and welcome to our presentation of the Gender, Race, and Ministry study done by the Board of Ordained Ministry done by the Board of Ordained Ministry for the Baltimore-Washington conference. We're so glad that you have joined us and we're excited to have a time of presentation, sharing the report and some of its deeper insights with you, and then a time of discussion. As we begin, I want to introduce to you the four persons who have helped guide, myself and three others who have helped guide the study and who will be presenting today. First, Dr. Janet Stocks, who is a sociologist with a long career in higher education and administration. Dr. Stocks was our primary researcher. She helped us design the survey and oversaw and conducted many of the individual and group interviews that happened. Along with Dr. Stocks, Dr. Hero Park, who is the lead pastor at Bethesda United Methodist Church, was part of the design team. Many of you, I would imagine, know Dr. Park. She has, in addition to being an elder here in our conference, she worked for a large portion of time with the General Board of Higher Education and Ministry, where she worked specifically with clergy women and racial ethnic clergy to be an advocate and a support for them. And then also Dr. Debbie Haskins, who is a lay member of the board. She's a clinician and scholar practitioner psychologist who specializes in social justice and cultural being of support to culturally diverse communities. The four of us together have worked deeply on the study. I am just so grateful for their help and wisdom and expertise, and I'm looking forward for you to hear from all of us today. Just a couple of other pieces just about how we're going to move through the morning. We're going to share the report with you, and then walk through what we did and our major findings. And then after that, we'll have a time of questions that we'll be collecting those questions in the chat. You can ask them in real time then as well. And then we're going to hopefully be able to have a few minutes to talk more deeply about each of the action items that we've grouped together, what we hope we can do in the future to respond to some of the things that we learned about the study. So we hope you'll stay for the whole time. We have presentation, discussion, and then future actions. Now, because I would like this to be a time of community building, we have a couple of questions to get us started. So the first one was just to invite you to share your names. We had a sense of who we are. So I'm going to invite that word cloud to come up when we're ready. God, we give thanks and praise for all of those who are here today. We invite your spirit to be with us as we learn together. And then, because it's always good to begin the day with praise, our second question was, what's something that you give praise for today? It's great to see the Orioles in there as a Baltimorean, and the family and community that surround us, and the weather, and the breath of God that moves through that. So thank you for being a part of our community gathering today. All right, let's move into the study. I wanted to share briefly three impetus for the study, how the study came to be. The roots of it began in the early part of 2020, kind of those sweet months before the pandemic began. And one of the things that the board began to talk about in the early part of 2020 were the differences that we were noticing in the experiences and the orientation to ministry of our candidates. Some of these were very small differences, or subtle would probably be the best word to use for them, subtle differences, but we started to see them, that different candidates, obviously we're all individuals, we're all ourselves, but there were differences, particularly around the lens of race and gender, and how persons were experiencing the pathway to ministry and experiencing life within living as a set apart minister. So that encouraged us to want to learn more. In those conversations, we also looked back to a study that happened here in the Baltimore-Washington Conference in 2004 and 2005. This was a study that looked at clergy retention, mobility, appointments, salaries, experiences of call. That specifically highlighted, the results of that study specifically highlighted some of the gender and racial gaps in salary and appointments. That study actually had deep roots in the study that happened through the Anna Howard Shaw Center at Boston University a few years before, that grew out of the awareness that women in particular were leaving local church ministry at higher rates than men. That they were staying ordained, but looking at extension ministries. So we had these two, in my opinion, really landmark studies, and we wanted to see where we were 20-ish years later. So much of our study was based on that 2004-2005 study. And then lastly, the last impetus for this study was the board's desire to live into our role as stewarding the lives of those in set apart ministry. A lot of what the board does and a lot of what gets our attention sometimes are the examinations, that all the processes that lead towards the becoming a provisional member or becoming a full member. But the board's charge is to steward our lives through all pieces of ministry. So, our care for ministers doesn't end at ordination. And so we wanted to know what's it like right now to be in ministry? What are the joys? What are the struggles? Where are some of the differences that need our attention? So those were the three impetuses. And as Dr. Sachs now is going to share with you more about the details of the study.
Thanks, Amy. So there were basically three parts to the study. We did a survey. I believe this was sent out in the early parts of 2022 to all clergy members in the conference. And this survey, as Amy said, was based largely on the survey that was done by Cosrow in 2003, because we wanted to be able to compare and see if there had been any changes. The survey, we had a 39% response rate, which as a social scientist, anything above 20%, you have some confidence that it gives you a picture of the population that you're serving. The Cosrow survey that was done in 2003 actually had a higher response rate, but we had a decent response rate, and the participants in the survey largely look like the population of clergy members in the conference, although it leaned slightly white and slightly female, but there were participants in the survey that were diverse, and that so we got a lot of information from that. Some of the things that we looked at, we decided that we really wanted to dig into the conference database to look at things like salary and appointments, because we wanted to make sure we got kind of the true picture of what was going on. So when you see things about salaries and appointments, that was drawn directly from the conference database. After we did the surveys and did a little bit of analysis on that and looked at that, we started conducting interviews and focus groups, both with clergy members and with lay people in the congregations who came forward and volunteered to participate. And so we had about 40 conversations overall, either as individuals or in focus groups that were part of the data also. And then as we were finishing doing analysis and looking at what was going on, Amy and I talked and decided that we would like to ask a question more pointedly, which was about flourishing. And we gave people a definition of flourishing and asked if they would say that they were flourishing in their ministry or not. So we have we have some data on that we can share with you as well.
So from this study, we have 6 findings that we want to share with you today. Finding number 1. In the past 20 years, the gender and racial gaps existing in appointment settings and ministerial salaries have significantly diminished. This progress towards equity can be celebrated even as we attend to other persisting inequities.
So this slide shows you some of the data on, and like I said, this came straight from the conference database. So we feel like this is representative of the whole conference. So currently, females and males are making approximately the same. This is not statistically different between the males and the females. Females are making, on average, slightly more than male pastors are making in the conference. And there's still some variability in compensation by ethnicity, as you can see in the second graph there. And so I would say that still needs to be monitored a little bit, but in general, the salaries are fairly consistent across both gender and ethnicity. And the gaps have certainly closed quite a bit from the 2003 survey. So this slide has a lot going on in it. So what you can see on the left-hand slide is that most pastors are in smaller churches across. So there are more smaller churches than larger churches. That's one thing you can see. And there's some variability, but women are definitely leading some of the larger churches. And this is a big difference from 2003, where there were very few women in the larger churches. The second graph is a little bit difficult to interpret, but let me help you with that. So one of the things that you can see very easily in this graph is there are more white pastors in all size of churches. The gap is smaller than it was in 2003, but still whites are slightly overrepresented in the larger churches. And one way you can tell is, so if you look at the table underneath the graph, and that tells you the percentage of each ethnicity in each size church. So for instance, Asian pastors make up 4.9% of the population of pastors in the conference. So you can see that they're slightly underrepresented in the very smallest churches and slightly overrepresented in the largest churches. Blacks make up 33.6% of the pastors in the conference. So you can see that they are slightly overrepresented in the smaller churches and slightly underrepresented in the larger churches. Hispanic Latino pastors make up 2.1% of the population, and white pastors make up 58.4% of the population. So you can see that they're slightly underrepresented in the smaller churches and overrepresented in the larger churches. But even with those slight differences, the gaps have definitely diminished from the 2003 survey. So this just gives you some comparisons between the 2003 and the 2022 survey. So for one thing, in the 2003 survey, there was a larger gap between at the age that people felt called to ministry and the amount of time that they spent in ministry. And those gaps haven't disappeared, but they have closed somewhat. So one of the things that we asked about was about the experience in the process to ordination. And African-American pastors reported a more difficult time getting through the process than white pastors did. And here are a couple of quotes. When I first became a candidate, I was assigned a mentor. And the mentor that they gave me was a wonderful spiritual guide, but she didn't help me write my paper. I didn't know that that was her job. And so it was one of those things where it just seems like from the start, I'd been set up to fail a bit. So my certified candidacy was delayed by a year in terms of trying to figure out what my mentor's role was. And this was something that I heard a fair amount from the people of color who I interviewed about the ordination process. There was not enough clarity about what the role of the mentor should be and what the candidate should expect from the mentor. The second quote is, there's some inconsistency, I think, in terms of what mentors understand to be their role. Is it okay to ask your mentor to give you feedback on what you have written? I remember specifically during my time, the person who was my mentor told me that she could not give me any feedback on what I had written. She couldn't tell me anything about what the exam would be like. And so that first exam for me, I was like a deer in headlights. When I got there, I was shocked by the experience. And for me, it felt like a hazing experience, just the way it was set up.
I think that we're going to discuss
Yes,
context. If
yes.
we can go
Dr.
back. Okay.
Haskins, would you, we would love for you to join.
Okay, yes. So when we look at the findings, we can see that there has been improvement in terms of the gaps. But we also see that as you get the qualitative data from these quotes, for example, that people are expressing their experiences racially and how they didn't feel perhaps that the process was an equity process. So the question is, how are we providing any candidate the experience so that everyone has a similar experience, although we know that every candidate is going to have their own unique experiences. In terms of the ordination process, we want to ensure, in terms of BOOM, we want to ensure that people are not experiencing changes or differences based on their race, their racial identification. Okay. And we do know, all of us probably know, that there's definitely been differences in the hiring process in terms of individuals outside of the church, what their experiences have been in job seeking or going up for candidacy in other types of occupations and career job processes. One of the commitments we've made on BOOM is we've been spending some time over the last couple years, especially, we've been spending time on looking and examining implicit bias, looking at it from our own experiences, being really conscious, because the reality is that everyone participates in implicit bias. It just is what it is, and it operates unconsciously. But what we're trying to do is to become more conscious of our implicit biases. Perhaps what are they racially? What are they ethnically? Are there differences in how we interpret, a person's experience if they are American born versus they're coming in from another cultural experience outside the United States? And what we see here is the whole issues around mentoring. Mentoring, how is that experience equitably across all candidates? So everyone should have the same experience of mentoring when they're a candidate. It shouldn't be that certain people, based on their race, their ethnicity, their gender, have a more positive experience in terms of mentoring, and then others who don't have, say, racial privileges and ethnic privileges, that they have something quite different. So BOOM has made a real commitment to ensure that we are examining our process of candidacy, including mentoring. What is the role of mentors? How people understand mentoring. Is there consistency and standardization across, so that implicit bias is not, affecting a person's experience.
Can I say something?
Please, Dr. Park.
Yes. Our ordination process has a well-structured mentor system in place. However, when it comes to women of color candidates who have been affected by racial and gender discrimination, it is important to have mentors who can validate their experiences of disapproval or disparaging remarks and devaluation without judgment. So in order to do this, we need mentors who can listen deeply to these candidates and understand institutional marginalization and powerlessness, cultural imperialism, and silencing, deprecation, and vilification, just like Dr. Haskins just mentioned. So maybe how we train our mentors would be very important.
Dr. Park, thank you. And we will return to these ideas that both you and Dr. Haskins have named when we get to our action items or recommendations at the end. Let's move on to finding number 2. Although inequities in salary and appointment settings for female clergy have diminished, a person's gender continues to impact one's experience in ministry. Female clergy persons reported that their gender impacted their experience of ministry. In personal interviews, almost all clergy women described experiences ranging from microaggressions to sexual harassment, even sexual assault.
So this came from the survey that we did. We asked on the survey if gender, and we asked this of race too, and we'll get to that later, if gender contributed to, had any impact on the experience that they had as they were entering an appointment. And female participants, some said negatively, some said it didn't matter, and some said it was positive. There were no male participants in the survey who chose that their gender negatively impacted their welcome experience. And this was also the case during the course of their ministry, that that females were more likely to report that gender had a negative experience on their experience in the ministry, whereas the male participants, none of them identified gender as being anything that had an impact, any kind of negative impact on their ministry.
These quotes come from the personal interviews, perhaps even some of the group interviews, and the 4 presenters are going to each read 1 or 2, and then we'll offer some comments as well. We're going to start in the upper left-hand corner if you're looking at your screen. That should say in probably every appointment at some level, I've dealt with levels of sexual harassment as a female. It is pretty common for us as female clergy to have some inappropriateness in our direction too, placed in our direction too.
There needs to be a clearer process for how.
As a single Asian woman, I don't think people took me seriously in the beginning.
I mean, when I was 25 as a pastor, it was an everyday struggle. Every little thing from preaching, that my voice was too soft. And I think that also had to do with both my age and my gender too. It was every little thing.
I've been told that the only reason men come to church is because I'm the only female pastor in the community, and I wear dresses on Sunday morning, and they want to look at my legs. I have been touched inappropriately more times than I can count by both men and women. I have had people call and have inappropriate conversations as they're trying to work out whatever sexual fantasy they have. I have had sexual harassment that has been both reported and unreported. It is a constant barrage of everything. if it weren't for a strong sense of call, nobody would put themselves through that.
I wanted that top blue one that says there needs to be a clear process. I apologize. I'm not sure what happened with the letters there, but what it should say is that there needs to be a clear process for reporting sexual harassment by parishioners. Panelists, do you want to add any pieces to these interview quotes? Any insights or additions?
Well, I want to share my thoughts regarding the experiences of racial ethnic clergy women, considering the intersectionality of race, gender, and class. The presence of these women in the clergy highlights the impact of patriarchal, colonial, and Western imperialistic power structures within the church, which have been responsible for suppressing their voices and limiting their opportunities. So the voices of racial ethnic clergy women are often silenced because the church does not give them the same level of respect and confidence as other representatives. As a result, these women are often considered less competent. If they share their experiences, they may face negative consequences and trouble. However, if they choose not to share, they may be viewed as mere teaching subjects rather than spiritual leaders. However, their ministry makes the church more relevant and contextual. Their presence is a constant reminder of the value, dignity, and power of all those called to set apart ministry by God.
Thank you, Dr. Parks. And I just want to add regarding racial, and I use the term not microaggressions, I'm going to say they are aggressions. Because when a person experiences a racial aggression, it's typically not micro. And what are racial aggressions? Microaggressions is the terminology we use. These are the daily insidious threats that are based on race and how a person is being treated, how they're being viewed. And these daily insidious attacks constantly over time definitely impacts a person's psyche. It impacts their body. It impacts their spirit. It impacts their job performance. It impacts the way they show up in the world. So it's not just one incident. These incidents that happen in the life of the church, if you will, are cumulative, and because they're a part of other experiences and incidents, and it all starts to bleed into one another. And so a person, it's no surprise that you see, for example, that men of color in general, in terms of psychological functioning, they have higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of chronic diseases. And a lot of this is attributed to showing up in a world that doesn't see you and constantly disrespects, mistreats you, and don't prize and validate your existence. And so the challenge is that we need to examine that in the community, in the institution of the church. In what ways are we in participating without even being conscious of these racial aggressions? And if a person doesn't have the proper resources of support, then they can't thrive. Their well-being is affected, their leadership is affected, their thriving is affected. And so the other issue becomes, as Dr. Parks mentioned, that a person may not feel safe to share these aggressions to their supervisors, depending on who the supervisor is, racially, ethnically, or gender. It may also be their concerns about how the conference will view them And so if they don't feel that they're going to be validated and that they have a safe place, they may not share those experiences because they're concerned about how the sharing will be interpreted. The other issue that we see is startling regarding sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is unacceptable in any environment, whether it's inside the church or outside the church. And it's unacceptable, and it creates a consistent, continual, oftentimes anxiety that impacts a woman when you're having these encounters in the world, one, but also in the life of the church. And so how are we providing safety environments where if a woman leader and pastor has these experiences by their community members, their congregational members, and maybe even by individuals who are in the called ministry, how are they supported? How are they protected? Are there safe places where they can report, whether they can know that they have a right to share how they are impacted and to be able to feel that the conference will support them? And so we'll talk about that when we get to recommendations. In short, what we want is we want to have safe places for people to function, for them to thrive, for them to lead, for them to serve. And we do not want participants who may be congregational members or community members to be the offenders. We also want to make sure that people who are victims / survivors of these threats, that they have, they know that they are going to be supported.
Thank you, Dr. Haskins. Finding number 3. Clergy persons of color name the impact of race on their experience of ministry. Racism impacts the ministry experiences of clergy persons of color. Furthermore, as the primary persons appointed to cross-racial appointments, clergy persons of color suffer the heightened demands of such appointments. They bear the brunt of the biases and the aggressions they experience from their congregations.
So this again is from the survey, and very much like the gender question that we asked, does race have an impact on your welcoming experience in a congregation? Non-white participants in the survey chose the 3 response options: contributed positively, not a factor, or contributed negatively, in fairly equal numbers. Whereas no white participants selected contributed negatively, that race contributed negatively to their experience of the ministry or their welcoming experience into the ministry.
Again, we want to share some quotes with you. I'll start again. Go ahead, Dr. Haskins, go for it.
Okay, every church believes they would welcome a different gender, race, or culture, but when it happens, I think this is meaning to say they don't.
Right, it says when it happens, they do not.
Oh, they do not. Thank you.
So when I have conflict in church, I have to think, is it because I'm a woman clergy, or additionally, is it because I'm a minority here?
Being a pastor is hard. Being a pastor of color in a racialized context that has always been violent towards Black and brown bodies is even harder. And the lack of support and services, and even attention to the fact that we need those supports and services, also just speaks to the fact that leadership does not necessarily care for clergy of color. We have this church that says open doors, open hearts, open minds, but it's not present in the policies and practices. And what is present is a lot of harm and exhaustion that people who are made in the image of God endure all the time.
Sometimes churches are matched with a pastor who they are not ready to fully embrace because of their gender or ethnicity or culture. The pastor might have the spiritual gifts that the congregation needs, but the congregation can't accept those gifts from that particular body.
Any additional comments from our panelists?
Mhm. I would like to share my thought on the quote regarding conflict within the church. When conflict arises in a especially cross-racial and cross-cultural setting, it can be overwhelming as the root causes and drivers of conflicts are often not addressed. Inequality, discrimination, power imbalance, and structural issues are the underlying causes of conflict. It is crucial to address these issues as conflicts are influenced by larger cultures, systems, and structures. So conflict transformation should involve dialogue, reconciliation processes, capacity building, community engagement, and structural changes to create a more inclusive and just ministerial context.
Thank you,
So-
Dr. Park. Dr. Haskins?
Yes. So, you will remember what we have shared even up until this point in terms of race, ethnicity, the intersectionality, as Dr. Parks illuminated, in terms of aggressions and microaggressions. But the reality is that we can see from our participants' responses is that the psychological impact and the spiritual impact on their encounters where they're not welcomed or received with open arms, that there's these differences in terms of experiences. And so the question arises as to how are we providing support to pastors in these cross-racial appointments, for example, as one, but also how are we providing supports for pastors who are appointed to churches and congregations, and they are, uh, women, and they may also be a leader of color. So there's a lot of research that talks about acculturation, and acculturation is a sociological process that looks at what happens when people move to a different culture, when they move to a different experience, when they cross from their cultural experience, say, uh, and they move into another experience where they may be different. We understand that there's sociological impacts in terms of that community experience of transition. But now we understand that there's a psychological impact during these transitions. That is not just understanding what happens to the group, say the church, when they receive a pastor of color and or a woman and a pastor of color, but what happens for the person who is the leader. And so there's these parallel processes that take place, the receiving community and the person who's entering the community. And what we know is needed is that people need support, on both sides. We want the receiving community to have preparation because now they're going to have a new experience of having someone outside of their culture be leading and be in a relationship with them. And what is that like for them? What experiences have they had? Have they lived their life more privileged, where they have had most encounters with people who look like them, talk like them, live like them? Maybe they have had more homogeneous interpersonal experiences. They've not stepped outside of their culture, depending on where they live and how they show up in the world. All right. But then we also need to provide support and preparation for the pastoral leader. We want to make sure that a person is not stifled, and that they are not experiencing a burden of these additional stress factors, in addition to learning the community, learning the culture, figuring out what the needs of the congregation and community is. And now you add this other layer that colors everything of race, ethnicity, gender, etc.
Thank you, Dr. Hoskins and Dr. Park. Let's move to finding number 4. Those in set apart ministry want to engage in fruitful ministry with their full selves. But such flourishing is not universally experienced. Rather, one's gender, race, age, and ministry setting impact the likelihood of reporting satisfaction in ministry. We found 2 pieces had were deeply intertwined with whether someone felt they were flourishing in ministry. One was that they were in what we'd call meaningful ministry, that their ministry setting was producing fruit, felt purposeful or meaningful to them and those involved in it. And secondly, that the minister felt a freedom to be themselves. Both of those pieces brought a sense of flourishing. Dr. Starks, do you want to go through our findings in more detail?
Yes. So the flourishing survey that we did, which was just at the end of the study, and it was a very quick survey. It basically had 2 main questions, which is after this definition of flourishing, do you feel that you're flourishing in your ministry, and then why or why not? And then we, of course, asked some demographic information so that we could look at the different populations. But so here is flourishing by gender on the left. And as you can see, more males answered yes, they are flourishing than females, and more females answered no, they're not flourishing than males. But I do want to say that approximately 70% of those who responded to the survey said that they were flourishing. So we felt that that was a good, that was good that about 70% did. But when we started breaking down the data, we found some interesting results. So most females say that they're flourishing, but more females than males say that they're not flourishing. And then when we look at race on the left here, interestingly, non-white pastors were more likely to say that they're flourishing. And that's a statistical difference at the yes column. That when we get to the no column, there were, similarly more white, but just slightly more white pastors saying that they're not flourishing. So we wanted to look at intersectionality, as has been discussed already in this webinar. And so we looked at flourishing by gender and race. And interestingly here, non-white males were the most likely to say that they're flourishing. So almost 90%, high 80% of non-white males in the ministry are saying that they're flourishing. And white females were the least likely to say that they're flourishing. So just over 50% of white females say that they're flourishing in ministry. And then appointment type. So what we see here is that fewer of those in the local church ministry say that they're flourishing. More of the pastors in local church ministry were apt to say that they're not flourishing than any of the people in the other forms of ministry. So set apart ministry, local ministry is causing some stress. And then this is an interesting one by age. The older you get, the more likely you are to say that you're flourishing, basically. And when you're retired and looking back on your whole career, you're the most likely to say that you were flourishing in your ministry. I think this reflects the fact that getting started in the ministry is difficult and challenging, and it takes a while for people to get in a good stride and to feel that they have those elements that lead to flourishing, which is feeling like they're doing productive things in the ministry and also feeling like they're being their authentic selves. So you can read these factors. We found that certain factors seem to be linked to a feeling of flourishing on the part of the pastor, and certain things led to feeling like not flourishing.
Here's a collection of quotes from the interviews. Again, we'll share them with you. Local church ministry can be isolating and overwhelming. Finding ways to help clergy know what they can realistically accomplish and to help local churches not demand so much of their pastors would be very helpful. The issue of clergy colleagues and creating authentic networks of support would be worth exploring too.
I feel support with my team. I'm in a congregation that aligns with my values and theology. I've had a long tenure at a wonderful mission-oriented congregation with engaging, fulfilling worship.
My current appointment demands skills for which I have not been trained, makes me feel inadequate to the task and that the job is impossible.
The mainline church is declining, but the conference makes me feel like if I'm just good enough pastor or have enough SMART goals, my church should grow. I wake up every morning feeling like a failure before I even start my day.
I continue to grow, learn, and am comfortable in myself.
Panelists, any other comments we want to make about flourishing at this point?
I just want to say that I heard from people again and again in the interviews that the pandemic was a challenge for them and the feeling of flourishing, and that people felt exhausted by the pandemic. And on the other hand, there were some very creative solutions in the congregations to the pandemic that some people feel like have improved their ministry overall.
To ensure the success, hello?
Please go ahead, Dr. Parks.
Okay. To ensure the success of clergy women, I want to argue that it's crucial to remember that we are relational beings and cannot be separated from our community, regardless of gender. In his theology, Desmond Tutu emphasizes the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which highlights the interconnectedness of all humanity. The word Ubuntu, which means humanity in the Zulu language, also means I am because you are. In other words, we need each other to thrive as human beings. The marginal experiences of clergy women can create a transformative space where individuals and communities can develop a unique understanding of injustice, empathy, and resilience. Especially the experience of in between and in both biracial ethnic clergy women can help bridge the gap between the two worlds, the intersection of race and gender, promoting healing and reconciliation. As a faith community, living in beyond is possible through the solidarity of its members, which forms the foundation for clergy women's flourishing ministry.
Thank you, Dr. Parks. I appreciate the way you started with the fact that we're relational beings. Okay, let's move on to finding number 5, which connects with what Dr. Stocks just said a few minutes ago. The pandemic, cultural wars, and the UMC schism have affected all those in set-apart ministry. And at the same time, there are signs that clergy persons are striving to model strong self-care.
So this was another place where we compared the findings of the 2022 survey with the 2003 survey. And what we found is that self-care has improved in the interim. So there are more people who took this survey who reported, for instance, taking at least one day off a week, that they felt encouraged by their setting to do self-care, and that they were in good health. So we were happy to see that this part of the ministry has seemed to have improved over the last 20 years. Although, like, if you can see the last quote, the last bullet point here, I'm tired, my congregation is tired. And I think that was for all the reasons that Amy just noted: the pandemic, the schism, the upcoming schism, or the current schism in the church. And other things are really weighing on people out there.
One of
Well-
the, please, Dr. Park, go ahead.
I mean, can I make a comment?
Please.
Yeah, self-care can be a challenging practice for racial ethnic clergy women, especially compared to their counterparts who do not face the same intersectional challenges. The difficulty in practicing self-care is rooted in various systemic, social, and cultural factors that disproportionately affect these women. It is indeed easier said than done. For example, the majority of racial ethnic clergy women serve the small congregations, which limit the access to resources and opportunities for self-care. They are also paid 9 to 15% less than white male clergy in our denomination. So the intersectionality of race, gender, and class creates additional challenges for their mental and emotional well-being. Racial ethnic clergy women often feel obligated to their communities, so making it difficult for them to prioritize their own self-care needs without feeling selfish.
Very
Yes.
important pieces to remember.
And I would like to add, if I can, that the word self-care is an oxymoron for many people who are coming from non-white backgrounds, non-European backgrounds, as Dr. Parks has highlighted, where you're part of a communal family and communal community. The focus is on the group, the family, the community. And so this notion of self is quite opposite of how you live your life as a person of culture. And so, it means that we also have to understand these unique cultural interpretations. And we want to also be thoughtful about, self-care. A lot of people are on the bandwagon about self-care, engage in self-care. But for many people, this closer examination of how they cognitively process it, how they spiritually and psychologically interpret self and care becomes really the conversations. And then they can move into creating a validated, culturally validated model of self-care that doesn't ask them to leave their cultural identities outside at the door, but that this is part of who I am, this is part of my well-being, this needs to be part of my continual identity and thriving.
Thank you, Dr. Haskins. Let's move on to finding 6. One unexpected topic raised by the study centered upon the itineracy process within the United Methodist Church. Although addressing this issue goes beyond the bounds of the study, overall, participants articulated that the itinerary system in its present form needs assessment and possible retooling. We're not going to, this is absolutely one of our findings and part of the published report, but when we elected today to spend more time on other pieces of the findings. So I'm going to move on to our recommendations, but certainly we could address this one in the Q&A if you would like. All right, recommendation number 1. Recognizing that pastors appointed to cross-racial or cross-cultural ministry settings shoulder significant challenges and are recipients of racial comments and actions, additional supportive structures are necessary. Such supportive measures include strong training for pastors and congregations prior to the appointments. Dr. Haskins named that earlier today, talked about it in greater detail. So strong training, active coaching for both congregation and pastors during the ministry years, and provisions for additional time away or leave, and higher salaries for those serving in such settings. That's recommendation number 1. Would one of my colleagues share recommendation number 2?
Recommendation number 2, recognizing the prevalence of microaggressions and sexual harassment faced by female clergy persons, the study recommends understanding female pastors as serving in settings equivalent to cross-cultural appointments. As such, female pastors also need more active training, coaching, and supportive networks, additional leave, and added compensation. And we will also be talking about, when we get to the group, and momentarily in terms of recommendations and your thoughts, talking about what that means for congregations also. Expectations for the congregations.
Thank you.
Recommendation 3, recognizing the high instances of sexual harassment and instances of sexual assault experienced by female clergy persons, a standardized system for reporting and responding to instances of sexual harassment or assault needs to be established.
Recommendation 4. Finally, the mentoring system for candidates for ministry needs strengthening so that the process and the expectations for both mentors and candidates are clear. The system should provide attentive support for all candidates, including training in the unique challenges faced by persons of color and females.
So we're at that space where we want to hear from you. So my understanding is that we're going to ask anyone who has a question or a comment during the discussion period to raise your hand, and I will verbally invite you to speak, and then we'll get you unmuted. So I am not seeing any hands raised, and I'm wondering if I have it wrong. If one of my panelists can see it, you are welcome to call on someone.
Yeah, I don't see any hands raised, and I'm looking in the chat.
Joy Jones.
Joy
Hand
Jones,
raised.
go for it.
Okay.
Please, Joy.
You have to unmute. There you go.
I had turned my microphone off so that you couldn't hear me. But Amy, I'm sure you knew I was going to have something to say.
Oh, I'm so glad you do.
Can I make several comments on different subjects all at once, or do you want me to stay with one?
Why don't you go for it?
Okay, I'll go for it. First of all, with respect to mentoring, I was a mentor for 25 years. And one of my fortunate things was I had two excellent mentors when I was a candidate. In addition, I had a superb mentor when I was doing what's now called PM&M. And from those, I learned good mentoring, and I tried to apply that. And one of my lessons was it is my job as a mentor to help my candidates succeed. And whatever that means is what I do. And sometimes succeeding means not choosing to go into ordained ministry, but it also means reading their papers and saying, this is a junk of whatever, and you need to go back and work on this. Not giving them answers per se, but giving them questions about what do you mean by that? Do you really mean by that? And some time ago, the GBHEM published something that basically said it was 6 ways to make sure your candidates fail. And almost all of them had to do with lack of interaction with mentors who basically said, you're on your own. I'm just here to go through the candidacy guidebook. So I think, Hero, I don't know where that is back in the bowels of GBHEM, but I'm sure it's there. And I found it as a mentor to be very, very useful. So that's comment number 1.
Okay.
Comment number 2, about self-care, and I appreciate particularly what Dr. Haskins said. I don't know you, so I'm not going to call you by your first name. I'm very respectful that way, but I know Abby and Hero, so I can call them by their names. First of all, when I retired, I realized how exhausted I was. I was totally and completely exhausted. I had always taken a day off. I had always taken vacations. But one of the things I had never done was to take a Sabbath leave. In 21 years, I should have taken 2 or 3, and I did not. And I have encouraged my own pastor to do that, which she did, and I have covered for a couple of other clergy who recently have done that. And I think there's more an acceptance that that's an okay thing. But not only is self-care a concept that's difficult for all kinds of ethnic, racial, whatever groups, but it's also fundamentally hard for women. I think women have less a sense of, and caring for myself is just as important as caring for other people. And if caring for myself includes cooking supper for the family every night, then that's a good thing. I think it just would need to be very flexible on that. Sexual harassment. I'm sad to say I was not surprised by the data. I almost broke into tears when I saw the data, but this is a uniform experience of women I have known. And it comes into direct conflict with the preaching that we get from the hierarchy that clergy always have the power in a church. And that is simply not true in some situations. And I think it's particularly not true for women, and I think even more so women of color. We do not have all the power unless we are able somehow to assert it. And when you assert your power as a woman, you are considered to be aggressive, pushy, and bossy. I have served in many different careers in my life, and sadly, the church is no different. The biggest problem that I see on all of this is who do you turn to for help, and how do you get help? People don't believe you. And in 2023, people should be believing women, but we are not. And in considering appointments of particularly of women and various ethnic groups, one of the issues I see today is there is a very very much a lack of interaction among the DSs, the pastors, and the congregations. So how do you make a good appointment if these three groups are not in frequent conversation? So
Joy, thank you. I mean, you have excellent
Shut up
points
now.
here around mentoring, self-care, and sexual harassment. We're going to address, you saw one of our recommendations was about a standardized system, and that is an action item that we will talk about a little bit more about in a second. One of the other things that the board has talked about, but has not talked about fully as a group, is if there are ways that we can provide funds to help allow people to be on Sabbath leave. It's not inexpensive to figure out who's going to care for a church while you're away. And for some clergy persons, that's the reason they don't go, is because they don't have the funds to do it. I know the next question was from Rachel Cornwell. Rachel, do you want to unmute?
Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Yes.
I did put my questions in the chat, but I think my questions go beyond the scope of this survey, which I want to just also thank you all for not only for doing this survey, but for taking the time to share the results with us. It's really interesting, and there's much work to be done. I'm curious about that closed gap between people leading large churches, and that there's a narrowing in terms of salary and appointments in the disparity between white male clergy and others. And I would just be curious to know if there's been any change in what are considered the large churches or the higher salary churches, and if that growth is to the credit of women in leadership and people of color in leadership. And I just think that it would be interesting to look at that and to recognize that the gifts of those leaders. And I'm also curious how future surveys such as this could include the experiences of our openly queer colleagues. I think there are more and more of those folks who are serving in open and out ways, and I think their experience is really challenging and deserves to be heard. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. And that's an excellent piece to add to future studies. It was not something we looked at, but absolutely should be a part of it. Go ahead. And then anyone else?
I think it's a fairly small sample at this point, given the restrictive rules of our discipline, but I'm hopeful that that sample size will grow.
There was one openly gay pastor who I interviewed, so I did get a little bit of that. But I mean, in no way representative of anything, just an individual. But certainly the issue of LGBTQ persons in the ministry came up, not just with that person, but with some other interviews too.
Dr. Sarkis, do you want to add anything about Rachel's question around the closed gap of salaries or appointments?
So as I understood her question, maybe I didn't understand it, but it was about can we see any growth in those churches when there are female pastors in them, in the larger churches? And I didn't look at that data, so I can't answer that question, but it's a very interesting question for sure. It would be worth looking at.
Well, there is a study by GBHM in 2010 about the salary of our denomination clergy, and you may want to look at that. And there was a study also about clergy women serving large churches by GBHM. And in my experience, there were about 130 of them for the last about 10 years, and there were not much difference in terms of the number. And that is the same as district superintendent. For many years, our denomination had about 120 and 125 women DSs. And it didn't increase or really didn't decrease. So I don't know what that means, but it's usually static so far. just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Dr. Park. So our next question is from David Norton. David, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you, and thank you for the study. Just a couple thoughts, though. A lot of the recommendations, and one included increasing compensation for women and people in cross-cultural appointments and things. And I'm just wondering, now that I'm in ministry, where does the additional compensation come from when so many churches are already struggling? Would that be something the conference would help supplement? And then a lot of these recommendations, of course, I always think of the Board of Ordained Ministry kind of being, I don't want to say a silo, but a separate from the cabinet. And it seems to me a lot of these things, because they affect appointments and congregations and whatnot, would come from the cabinet side as far as implementation and follow through and care. And so I'm wondering what if there's been any thought or vision as to how that might happen. My sense already is that the district superintendents are so stretched, and that there probably could be a lot more care given to appointments and congregational settings and whatnot, but I just don't know that there's the bandwidth to do that. And there's also, I think, some compensation inequities that may not show up. I know some where, when it particularly relates to appointments with parsonages that are declined and things like that it can create some compensation inequities. And I'm not certain they're captured in the numbers if we're working from the conference numbers, because even if a parsonage is declined, if the package is a parsonage, they're still electing that they have a parsonage, but they're not actually living in it. It may not result in a housing allowance. So there can be some compensation inequities there, particularly I think amongst smaller churches. And then the other thing is, there was this discussion about implicit bias and everything. And a lot of this I'm hearing is from the perspective of supporting clergy, which is great. But at the same time, I think that, at least going through the process myself, I don't remember really, I've had implicit bias training, but it's not something that's been required. So I think there's a lot of clergy that could use implicit bias training themselves, because to me, it's also relational. Anytime you have cross-cultural appointments, we're not talking about one party, we're talking about multiple parties, not only the pastor or the congregational's care of the pastor, but the pastor caring for the congregation, and it works both ways. So I think there might be some need there. And then also, as much as we like to, I think that, a lot of this takes time, it takes care, it doesn't happen overnight. How can we help make clergy more resilient as they live through this, these challenges? Just my thoughts. Thank you.
David, thank you. Great thoughts. Resiliency is something to name and hold for all of us. Your first piece about where do the recommendations go, and what piece of this are things that the board can act on and what pieces are beyond the board's scope is an excellent one. We have been in conversation with the bishop and the cabinet about this report, and I anticipate we'll have additional ones. And some pieces of this belong to the whole annual conference. So another thought that we'll talk about in just a second is whether there's legislative pieces that we might do to address some of our recommendations. I see Dr. Park, were you wanting to add something? Hero? No, okay. So the next person in the queue is Kate. So Kate, I want to invite you to have your question.
Hi, thanks. And I apologize for my voice. I'm currently home with COVID. So hopefully you guys can understand me. I submitted this through the Q&A, and I don't know if that was the incorrect way to do it, but my question was, I know that mentors in ministry, I have heard wildly different stories. And I'm fortunate that both of my own experiences were good, but it is extremely unclear to me how mentors are selected by local DCOMs. For example, who's eligible to serve as a mentor, beyond the fact that I guess they would need to be an elder or deacon in full connection. And what training is offered to mentors by the districts? You know, I know, for example, that even as little as 5 years ago, I spoke with a male senior pastor who told me that they had requested not to receive candidates for mentoring, and yet we're mentoring 3 of them. They didn't think it was something they were particularly good at, and yet they were somehow continuing to be used in this capacity. So I'm curious if you can offer some insight into what the current process looks like and how it might differ among districts.
Excellent question. You'll notice that one of our recommendations was to really attend to the mentoring disparities that we're finding. So, and as you know, there are two primary ways that we use mentors. Some of it, a piece of it is the candidacy mentoring process, and that is done through our district committees. And our district committees are working really hard to be more uniform in what they do, so that they really know what's happening in each district. And we have within the Board of Ordained Ministry, there's a person who's identified as the chair of the district committees who kind of helps coordinate that communication. The other space that mentors are used would be if at any point in the process towards full membership and ordination, the board invites you to dig a little deeper on whatever piece of theology or pastoral care or practical ministry. Sometimes we'll ask a mentor to step in and provide some of that individual one-on-one coaching or mentoring. So those are the 2 primary ways they're used. The board does the second one, when it's become part of the process the board has, and the districts do the other. There are trainings available that come through the larger United Methodist Church, but it's an area we know that we need to do more work at, and that's one of our goals of the next year is uniformity and strengthening are part of that. Do any of Dr. Park or Dr. Haskins, anything you want to add to that? Anything I missed?
Yeah, I would just say thank you. One of the issues that I know Boom has been focusing on is, looking at the mentoring role and trying to correct the inconsistencies that may happen from one district to the next, so that, it's not going to matter, if you will, which zip code you live in, to see how you actually get the best quality care, say in the world, as we know, with like social determinants of health and issues like that. The other thing that we've been trying to clear up is, for example, I'm probably one of the first clinician lay members on the board. And so really trying to help, where the mentors may have been expected to do certain tasks that really isn't the role of a mentor, but more would be the role of a professional or a coach, for example. So I think we're still early in clearing up and trying to strengthen, but I like a lot of your comments and your recommendations. This discussion really will be helpful for us to go back to the board and to maybe, like, for an example, one thing that we did last year, because it's a different issue that candidates were struggling with the assessment process, for example. So we created like a video to help explain the assessment psychological review process of the candidacy, so that everybody gets the same information about what is that purpose, what is the intention of psychological review, and everybody is getting the same information and structured sort of information. And I think we probably can move to something like that, where we can create, maybe videos for mentors. We have training for the mentors. Maybe we need to create like a policy or as part of the procedures, because say when you serve on a board, it's the boards that do it well, it's a time limited. You're not serving into infinity. And so maybe we need to come up with those kind of recommendations as part of structuring the mentoring role and process.
Thank you, Dr. Haskins. Our next question is from Debbie Scott.
Now you can hopefully hear me.
You can.
Super. Thank you again for the study. I know how much time it involves. I was part of the 2004 study. So glad to see that we're trying to update our understandings and to really take some action as a result of this. I appreciate the mentor process and all the questions that have been coming about that, but I continue to see a gap. And I want to piggyback on some of what Joy was saying about relationship between the appointed process and not only that process, but what happens following the appointment and where can pastors expect to get their support. In my long career, and I can say gratefully I retired July 1, I have moved to Dagsboro, Delaware, and spent some time on the beach already this morning. So I'm working on that unwinding and unpacking the backpack that got very heavy after years. But it was often the superintendents that were the most guilty of not being supportive to a woman in a difficult position, would not take the time to understand from maybe a different perspective what was going on, and was shut down when need for support was very present. How do we hold our superintendents accountable in this process when we continue to hear that their schedule is so heavy, they don't have time to do individual charge conferences anymore? That relationship is getting thinner and thinner. If I were in the appointment season right now, I would be very frustrated with folks who are trying to connect churches that they're not attending or being present to with pastors who they're refusing to be pastors to. How can we hope for good appointments going forward? I tried to bring this up in a piece of legislation, and again, it was not approved. But if we don't have relationship with the folks sitting around the cabinet table to make appointments, how can we count on them when we have challenges? And how do we address it when they become part of the conflict and are not willing to look at their own role in that?
Thank you, Debbie. I hear the piece about relationships. As you know, this is a presentation from the board. So I'm not, I want you to know I heard you and took some notes. But I'm not sure what else I can offer right now. I do think the issue of clergy support is one that I think there's the issue. I think that self-care is an very important part of clergy support, but I also think it goes beyond that to how demanding ministry is for everyone right now. And I think there may be some structural or systemic things that the United Methodist Church as an entity could look at. And that's not going to address the problem today, but that's how I've been thinking about it.
I'd also like to add, if I can, that in the interviews that I did, it was clear to me that district superintendents are spread very thin, and we decided to not go with that as a finding. But I think, Debbie, that that the interviews kind of bear out what you say, that some structural issues, and district superintendents are put in the position where they have to be both a supervisor and a pastor to pastors, and it's kind of a difficult position to be in. So
Yeah.
that did come out in the study.
And can I just add to what Dr. McCullough and Dr. Stock said, and thank you, Debbie, for raising this really challenging issue, because it means that when we look at creating policies and new procedures, where, in terms of sexual harassment, maybe gender harassment and mistreatment, as well as any racial, that we also have to make sure that there's accountability for district superintendents and other leaders. It's not just the clergy or laity, but we also have to make sure that people know that if they have a complaint that includes someone in power and leadership, that this process is a safe one where they can we can hear them, and we can make sure that there's not this inequity based on power. And we know that exists in the world, and the church is no different. And a lot of times people who are victims and survivors and trying to stand up, they have to make a conscious decision in any second. Am I willing to take that on, because of the immense psychological and spiritual impact that's going to have on them? So thank you for raising these really important and challenging concerns and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Haskins. We have one last question that we have time for today, and then I'm going to speak briefly about some next steps and summarize. I know we have a few questions on the chat that I can answer and attend to as well. Reverend Lee, are you with us still and have a question?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, I have a question regarding sexual harassment involving women clergy. So my question is there any accountable group or a committee so that we can lean on for counseling to get some advice, or even protocol we can follow? Because at the beginning of my appointment, I had very negative experience. Well, even though I took some proactive actions to prevent potential incidents, but I felt very unsafe and frustrated by the fact that I don't have any safe place to share my experiences, especially, as I began my ministry, so that I haven't built enough trust with my congregation yet. So it's not easy to bring up this kind of issue and share it with even SPRC.
Great question. Such an important one. Thank you. So a couple of really quick pieces, and then I want to invite any of my panelists, any of my colleagues on the panel to offer some too. One is you can always contact the board. You can always contact us directly. Your district superintendent should also be a place to reach for support. COSRO, the General Commission on the Status and Role of Women, has a number, and I think it's a confidential number that you can call as a place to just start if you like. And then lastly, one of our recommendations is to create a standardized process and standardized training, because we know that some persons have reached out to various people around them and been believed and supported and gotten what they need to move forward, and other people have not. We know that is an issue, and it's one of our recommendations of something we want to work on between now and annual conference. Any other pieces I haven't added? Okay, we are at 11:30, and I want to honor your time. And so I have just a few things to say. I know that there were some questions in the Q&A that we didn't get to. One asked a question about why the poor mentorship was linked to race. I just want to be sure that you understand that, and within the study, what we noted were that clergy persons of color were more likely to have had a less than optimal experience with their mentor. And that's why one of our recommendations is to standardize this process so that everyone has an equitable experience with their mentor. Two, there were some questions around community care and paternity and maternity leave. When we talk about making sure clergy have their self-care, we are aware that it's very unusual to be in a profession where if you want to be away, you've got to figure it out yourself. So one of the things the board is looking at is how can we help make that easier? You may remember that we started that database for if you need someone to cover for you for a Sunday and you don't really know who to call, there's now a database on our website to invite you to find some folks. That's just a small step in what we think we need as a kind of a robust support system, because all of us are whole people, and maternity and paternity leave needs to happen, and to happen without a tremendous amount of stress. On the screen, you see the 4 different recommendations. If you are interested in being a part of helping us move forward with some of these towards implementation, I want to invite you to contact me directly, just so there's one clearinghouse. And we are going to, we don't have time today, but we're going to look at some additional conversations. We would welcome your help, and just feel free to reach out to me. And then lastly, we want to just name some of the other resources that there are available, and they are here on your screen. So we are a connectional church, and there are some very good trainings and places of resource places out there, and they're listed here for you. All right. I want to thank you so much for being a part of this webinar. We really appreciate your time and your interest. Blessings on the rest of your day.